Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get it on. Get it on. Coming at you from a secret backwoods location in the middle of Texas. It's the highly opinionated and controversial voice of traditional old-school Orthodox Christianity. This is Spiritual Combat with Dr. Scott Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to Spiritual Combat, the show where we engage the enemy using prayer, fasting, and full contact logic on the front lines and in the trenches, inviting you to join the resistance against the forces of lies, error, and evil. I am your host, Scott Sullivan, and welcome to the show. All right, so today I want to get a little bit philosophical. I've actually been gone for a while. We released our logic course in November, and then the holidays came, and so I've been unable to do a podcast in a while. So I'm kind of in a philosophy mood, if you know what I mean. I feel like getting a little cerebral, And so I want to philosophize today, and the topic I want to talk about regards science. I mean, by science right now, I mean the physical sciences, the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, all this stuff, and it's great stuff. But what I want to do is debunk a modern misconception about science, about the nature of science, of these physical science, because the modern misconception, like you see in a person, say like Richard Dawkins, other atheists, and really just this kind of idea spills over into the general populace, is that the physical sciences are kind of like the be-all, end-all, regarding human knowledge. If something's not scientific, then it doesn't even count as knowledge. You can kick it in the street, or take it or leave it, just opinion. If it's not, scientifically proven, then, well, it's just some sort of opinion or wishful thought, etc. Because the misconception is that science is sort of this be-all, end-all regarding human knowledge. Now, this is false, okay? This idea of science being the be-all, end-all of knowledge is false. And I love science. Science is great. I'm making use of science and technology right now, I think science is great. But my point is that the hard sciences are not the highest form of human knowledge. Now, just think about this for a second. Just the very nature of this topic. What are we talking about? We're talking about human knowledge. This very topic itself is a philosophical question. Right? We call it in philosophy epistemology, the study of knowledge. So I just want to say this right out of the gate, that when you get scientists like Dawkins saying these kinds of things, that, science gives us the highest form of human knowledge, that very statement itself is not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical one. He's making an epistemological claim about the nature of human knowledge. And Dawkins is just really not qualified to make those claims. He's a great scientist, but he's not a great philosopher. So, but let's just get back to the topic. That was a little bit of a digression, perhaps. But I just want to clarify that the very nature of this conversation itself is not a scientific one. It is a philosophical one. What sort of knowledge gives us the most certitude? That kind of thing. That's a philosophical question, not a scientific one. Now, this view that I'm attacking right now, this view that I'm debunking, goes by the name scientism. Scientism, nothing wrong with science, but scientism is this belief that I'm attacking right now, the idea that only science gives us knowledge. If something can't be proven, let's say, by the scientific method, by experimental hypotheses and verification of that hypothesis, whatever, then it's not knowledge. Only science gives us knowledge. This is scientism, and my first criticism of it is that it's self-refuting. It is self-refuting. It commits intellectual suicide. It's like saying my brother is an only child. When you say this kind of thing, instantly it's necessarily false. To say only science gives us knowledge, that statement itself cannot be proven by science. I mean, look, go get your test tubes, go get your telescope, go do some mathematical equations. You can do all that stuff you want, and you will never prove that, only science gives us knowledge. You see, that's not a scientific conclusion. That can't be verified by the scientific method. So when you say things like, well, we can only know things that are verifiable by the scientific method, that statement itself doesn't meet its own qualification. You see, it's self-refuting. Science can't even prove what you just said. You see. So there's no good reason to accept scientism. It is patently, I think, self-refuting. Now, again, this is not to attack science itself. I am attacking this philosophical distortion, if you will, of science that goes too far. Science itself is a great method. It's a great, wonderful way of understanding the world, of finding the causes of things in the world. I love science. I hate scientism. Scientism is not science. Scientism is a bad philosophy. It's a self-refuting philosophy. We should not accept it. And unfortunately, it seems to be implicit in a lot of people today. Now, my next point is that now that I've dealt with scientism, we can get rid of that idea that only science just gives us knowledge. Just kick that in the street, because that's just patently false. All right. But there is legitimate science too, and I like I said, I accept that. Science does give us knowledge. It gives us a sort of certain knowledge. But even here, my friends, science taken in the legitimate sense now, okay? Now I want to say that even the taken correctly, it gives us certain knowledge, but it does not give us the highest degree of certainty. It doesn't give us the most certain knowledge, even when taken in its true and legitimate sense. Let me tell you what I mean, because when we're talking about certitude here, we're talking about we have no reasonable fear of error. When I'm certain about something, if I'm certain about X, whatever X is, that means I'm not afraid of being wrong. You see, I'm certain. I'm not afraid. There's no fear of being wrong here. I am certain. That's what we mean by certitude. And what gives us this certitude is the evidence. Evidence is the cause of certitude. I'm certain right now that I'm sitting in front of my computer talking on a microphone because of the evidence, because of my sense experience. I have no reasonable fear of being wrong about that. You're certain you're listening to me on this podcast. You have no reasonable fear of that, of error about that, because of the evidence, because of the self-evident experience, given your sense experience, and so on. So evidence is the ground of certitude, is my point here. It's evidence that sort of, if you think of your mind as when you weigh beliefs, you think of your mind as a scale. You believe one thing more than another. You can think of it as a scale. Well, evidence is what tips that scale to one side or the other. And the stronger the evidence, the more the scale tips. Right? Okay. So the point here is that evidence is the ground for certitude, and we have different kinds of evidence, different ways that we know things. And I'm going to give you 3. So just try to follow along with me, because I'm getting a little philosophical here, and I don't want to lose you. But I'm going to give you 3 types of evidence, 3 sources of evidence that gives you 3 types of certitude. Now, the first type of evidence is the testimony of others. This probably covers most of the things you know. Most of the things you know because someone else told you. Maybe you read it in a book and the expert told you that way, or you learned it in school and the teacher told you. But most of the things that you know are known on the basis of human testimony. I know that whales are mammals. I have never looked. I've never seen a whale in my life in person, but I accept that as certain based upon the testimony of others. I've heard so many people say it. I've heard so many experts say that whales are mammals. I've got no good reason to think that's false. I've got no prudent fear of error here. Therefore, I'm certain that whales are mammals based upon the testimony of others. Take another example, maybe a more obvious one. You're certain about who your parents are. You have no fear of error. You're not reasonably fearful that you're making a mistake about that when you call someone mom or you call someone dad. You know for certain who your parents are. You see? Well, how do you know that? Well, you know that on the basis of testimony. Other people have told you. You've just grown up with these people, that they've told you that they are your parents, and then you just accept it. You've got no reason to think otherwise. So that's another type of knowledge that you have. And this is obvious for a lot of things, right? I mean, I'm certain that George Washington was the first president of the United States. I wasn't there. I didn't experience it myself, but I accept it as certain based upon the testimony of others. Again, I'm certain because I have no reasonable fear of error here. So that's one type of knowledge that we have. That's one type of certitude that we have. Now, the second type of evidence that we can have, and then a corresponding certitude about it, if you will, is the evidence of sense experience. In this case, you don't have to rely on the testimony of others. You're right there experiencing it yourself. Right? This is just your own personal sense experience can give you certitude. Just like I said a while ago, you're certain you're listening to this podcast right now. You have no reasonable fear of error about that based upon your sense experience of the world. Now, this is primarily the way that science works too. Science is based upon empirical observation. That just means that's just a fancy word for saying it's based upon sense experience. All right, we look at the world with our senses and we try to discover, the physical laws of how things work. So, take for example the law of gravity. Right, we see things falling all the time. Right, and science can infer from this sort of inductive process, a law of gravity. Or, we observe the world and we know that time and time again, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, we can we can infer a scientific law there. So we got these inductive generalizations, if you will, based upon our sense experience of the world. And from that, we can learn physical laws. This is typically how science operates for the most part, and it gives us certitude, right? I'm certain that if you put your water, a cup of water in the freezer overnight, I'm certain that in the morning it's going to be frozen. How do I know that? Well, based upon my sense experience of the world, I infer these physical laws, and we use this all the time. And as I said, this is typically the sort of reasoning that is found in the physical hard sciences, and it gives us certitude. So, I am not knocking scientific knowledge whatsoever. It is a legitimate and very good form of knowledge. Now, when I say these things give us certitude, I mean we have no reasonable fear of error here. But that doesn't mean we can't possibly be wrong. I mean, there is a logical possibility of error. Take the law of gravity. There's no contradiction in saying I drop my pencil right now and it goes up instead of down. That's a logical possibility. There could have been a world like that. There could have been a world where water does not freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe there could have been a world where water freezes at, say, 30 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. So while these physical laws have a certain necessity to them, they have to be that way. They're not absolutely necessary. There's no logical impossibility of them being otherwise. You see, things could go up when dropped. They don't, but they could. It's possible. There's no contradiction there. Water could freeze at a different temperature. It doesn't, but it's logically possible. you see. So while with these, when we learn these physical laws, the type of necessity here we're talking about is what we call a physical necessity. It's just, that's the way the world operates, even though it's, logically possible, it could have been otherwise. Still, that's the way this world operates, so there's a physical necessity there. But there's no contradiction. There's no absolute necessity here in saying that, things couldn't have been otherwise. Now, to help you get your mind around this, when I'm talking about the difference between, this physical necessity and an absolute logical necessity, let me just contrast that now with a third type of evidence, a third way we can know something or be certain about something. The first way was testimony from others, right? We can be certain about something based upon what others have told us. We can be certain about something based upon our own sense experience and our own inferences on how things operate, given our own experience of the world. But there's a third way we can know something, and we can know something based upon its own intrinsic evidence. Things can be self-evident and necessary based upon just an analysis of the concepts, what the very concepts mean themselves. For example, when I say something like, every triangle has three sides, I am certain about this. Every triangle has three sides. It's got to be the case. Absolutely must be the case, given the very nature of triangles themselves. That's what triangles are. A three-sided polygon. It can't be otherwise. I am certain about this, even more certain than I am about water freezing, you see. And the reason why is because triangles having three sides is metaphysically necessary. There may be a world where water doesn't freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but there cannot ever be a world where there's a triangle that doesn't have three sides. Do you get that? If you can get your mind around that, if you can get your mind around the idea that it's possible that water could freeze at a different temperature, right? But it's not possible that there could be a triangle that doesn't have three sides. That's the difference that I'm talking about. That's the difference between what we might call a physical necessity on one hand, the water freezing, and an absolute necessity or a metaphysical necessity, you might even call it a logical necessity, on the other hand. Every triangle has three sides. I am absolutely 100% infallibly certain about that latter one. Can't ever be a triangle without three sides. Now, this latter sort of necessity, this absolute necessity, this is the kind of necessity you see in mathematics. It could be, 2 + 2 = 4. There can't ever be a possible world where 2 + 2 = 10. Or that's impossible. That can't be the case. So mathematical knowledge would fall into this category that I'm talking about here. But also philosophical knowledge, more specifically, metaphysics, which is just a philosophical study of being, of reality. Metaphysical truths fall into this category of absolute logical necessity. Let me give you another example. So to take the principle of non-contradiction, the most fundamental principle of all reality and all rational thought, the principle of non-contradiction, which states that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same way. So a thing can't both be and not be at the same time and in the same way. The light can't be both completely on and completely off at the same time. A thing can't both be completely red and not red at the same time. A thing can't both exist and not exist at the same time. This is an absolutely necessary metaphysical principle of all reality. There can't ever be a possible world where something would, violate the principle of non-contradiction, that a thing can both be some sort of contradictory notion, like a round square. There can't ever be a round square. That's logically contradictory. That would both be a square and not a square at the same time. Let me give you another example, another metaphysical, philosophical principle called the principle of identity. the principle of identity states that everything is itself. It is what it is. And people say that, right? No, but it's like the principle of identity. The principle of identity is everything is itself, and it's not something else. You see, that's just self-evidently obvious. We can intuitively see these things. We can, with our own rational intuition, we can see the truth of these sorts of statements, that every triangle has three sides. 2 + 2 = 4. A thing can't both be and not be at the same time in the same way. Everything is itself. You see, we are absolutely certain of these things. We can't possibly be wrong about them. There's no possible fear of error here. Unlike the fear of error before, with our sense experience, yeah, it's possible that water doesn't freeze at 32, but there's no reasonable fear of error. Here, it's even more than that. Here, we're even more certain about the truth of statements. We can't possibly be wrong about this thing about triangles. We can't possibly be wrong about the principle of non-contradiction and things of this sort. So the point here is that this level of logical or mathematical level of certitude is a higher degree of certitude than what we can get from just mere sense experience. It's a higher degree of certitude than what we can get from the physical sciences. The physical sciences give us knowledge, yes, and we are certain of those conclusions, yes, but the certitude, the degree of certitude that we have in those scientific conclusions is not as strong as the certitude that we can get from certain philosophical propositions. In other words, philosophy can give us more certainty than science can. I know that's going to be probably going to tick some people off when they hear that, but doggone it, it's true. Let me say it again. Philosophy can give us more certainty than science can. Science is not the be-all or end-all of human knowledge. There are higher levels of knowledge in the sense that there are other fields of study that give us higher degrees of certitude. This is nothing new, folks. This goes back to Aristotle. This is an old idea. I'm not being controversial in the sense of just espousing something new here. It's controversial, yeah, but this is an old idea. This is ancient Greece we're talking about here. That metaphysics, philosophy, can give us a higher degree of certainty than what we can get from our own sense experience, than what we can get from the physical sciences themselves. That's not to knock the physical sciences when properly understood. That's just to say that they are not the be-all, end-all of human knowledge. There is a higher level of human knowledge than what can come from just the mere physical sciences. Good, sound philosophy. Can I get an amen on that? All right. I hope you can see my point. We're doing some, like I said, I'm doing some abstract philosophy here, and I'm not sure how much of you can, if you haven't had any philosophical training before, or haven't studied this stuff or thought about it, and I don't know how many of you can grasp this just in one podcast. Maybe play it again, you get the point, but I hope you can see the difference in the type of certitude that is offered here based upon the evidence. I said, number one, the primary way you know things, the most fundamental way, the most common, if you had to, list all the things that you know, most of the things that you know come from the testimony of others. Right? People told you that, right? That gives you a certain degree of certitude. Absolutely. You're certain that George Washington was the first president of the United States, not because you were there and saw it for yourself, but because other people said so. A whole lot of other people said so. And that does give you a certain degree of certitude. You're also certain about, what you're doing right now based upon your own sense experience. Okay, you're certain about that. But the highest degree of certitude is the type where you can't possibly be wrong. You can't possibly be wrong when you say you're certain about every triangle has 3 sides. Or you're certain about 2 + 2 = 4. Or you're certain about, a thing can't both be read and not read at the same time. A thing can't both exist and not exist at the same time. You can't possibly be wrong about that. That's the highest level of certitude. That's your highest level of knowledge. And that, my friends, is mathematical or philosophical knowledge. You see. So, to sum all this up, science is great. I love science. But to debunk the modern misconception, first of all, the idea of scientism, only science gives us knowledge. That's false. That's actually self-refuting, right, as I said earlier. So it's not just that, but science taken properly does give us knowledge. It's great, but it does not give us the highest degree of knowledge regarding certitude. Mathematics or philosophy is higher than that. Good philosophy, that is good metaphysics to be more particular, is a superior form of justification. There's a controversial statement for you. Philosophy can be a superior form of reason, a superior form of justification over the hard sciences. Good philosophy can warrant a greater amount of certitude in its conclusions than science can. And this, my friends, is very important because once you can understand that philosophy, metaphysics, is a legitimate form of human knowledge, even, doggone it, a superior form of human knowledge, whoa. See, this opens the whole door to a change in worldviews because now we can have philosophical arguments that show us things, that demonstrate things with certitude, regardless of what science says. You see, we can have philosophical arguments that show, for example, that you have a soul, that you are not just a body, that you're not just, this hunk of meat. You also have an immaterial component to you. We've got strong, conclusive philosophical arguments for that. You aren't just matter. You're soul plus body, you see. Pretty significant. Once that conclusion is established, that gives you a pretty significant change in your worldview, perhaps. Or we can have philosophical arguments, metaphysical arguments that demonstrate the existence of God, one immaterial, personal creator of everything else. We got strong philosophical demonstrations for this, my friends. So this is not. So I said I'm going to philosophize and get all philosophical on you, and I hope I didn't lose you in all this, because I'm drawing you back now to the importance of this topic, namely that there are legitimate forms of human reason in addition to science, and this opens the door, if you will, to a whole world of cool stuff that we can know about the world. We can know, I would argue, that God exists. We can know, I would argue, that we have a soul and things like this. And man, that really does change things, doesn't it? That's all we have time for today, folks. This is Scott Sullivan. Visit us on the web at www.scottmsullivan.com, where I have some more resources for you regarding Christian faith and apologetics, theology, and things of that nature. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can do that there on iTunes, or you can do it on your Droid device. Any device you have, you can subscribe to our podcast. That way you'll be notified when the next one comes out. I look forward to talking to you in the next episode of Spiritual Combat.
In your face with grace. You're listening to Spiritual Combat. Hardcore Catholic Radio. With Dr. Scott Sullivan. www.scottmsullivan.com.